Preserving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door. There's an unseen hand that pulls strings.
Well, welcome to Connecting the Dots. It's Tuesday morning, March 6th. And we are really excited about the program we have today. We have a personal friend and someone who I hold great admiration and respect for, Dr. Edwin Vieira, one of the true constitutional experts in this country. And Edwin, I first met and worked with Edwin Vieira when we were working on the Sound Money bill for the state of Montana, and I tried to assemble the experts that were truly the top of the line in constitutional money nationwide. And we had Edwin Vieira, Dr. Larry Parks, James Turk, and G. Edward Griffin on our team who tried to help us get the Sound Money bill through the state of Montana. We failed, but we failed because we had a very liberal legislature in place at the time, and it was just too new a concept for some people to accept. As it turned out, we would have been extremely wise to have passed that bill because the state would have been much further ahead had we done that. But with that, Edwin, today we're going to be talking about the Second Amendment. We're going to be talking about the enormous push right now from the public sector in the bureaucracies, let's say, and also the huge push that's on right now through the mainstream media to try to create new and really confiscatory gun controls in this country. And so with that, Edwin, I'd like you to maybe introduce yourself a little bit to our listeners. I know most of our listeners are somewhat familiar with you, but I also know that we had a tremendous amount of interest from people around the country when I sent out the announcement of the show coming up. So I want you to maybe give our listeners a little bit of your background, and then we can get into the subject.
Well, basically, Dan, as is relevant here, I've been an attorney since the early 1970s, and I specialized in constitutional law issues, at least in the sense that looked for cases that had those kinds of issues involved. That didn't mean that necessarily they were decided by the judges. Judges love to avoid those issues if they can, but that's what I was looking for. I did a lot of litigation in the First Amendment area in particular. Took a number of cases to the Supreme Court and was pretty successful, I think 4 out of 5. either I argued the case or wrote the brief. At least I was sitting there in front of the court. So that's not too bad. More recently, I've become interested in the Second Amendment, but the Second Amendment in relationship to the original Constitution and the militia clauses of the original Constitution on Article 1 and Article 2, and how that relates to such problems as martial law on the one side, homeland security on the other side of that coin. And of course, what we're seeing now, well, we've actually been seeing this for a number of years because school shootings are not something that just happened yesterday. Every time there is one, there's a decided call for some kind of radical gun control. But that's an area in which I'm particularly interested now because you're seeing more and more of it from a legislative perspective. Statutes passed in Connecticut and New york a few years ago dealing with so-called assault rifles. And then one passed in Maryland, I think it was in 2013, where they banned them. They banned the possession of a laundry list of so-called assault rifles. It's similar to the Clinton assault rifle ban. And that went all the way through the federal judicial system to the Court of Appeals in Richmond, Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. And they put out a en banc opinion, that is, all of the 14 judges heard the case, which is not the usual situation. Usually they have a panel of 3. They did have a panel of 3. The panel of 3 declared the statute unconstitutional. Then the whole court took it up, and by vote of 10-4, they declared it constitutional. On the interesting basis that these typical assault rifles, the AR-15 type, the AK-47 type, although they're semi-automatic, they are, according to the court, akin to or equivalent to or pretty much the same as, to use different language, with so-called weapons of war. And therefore, the Second Amendment doesn't protect them at all. This wasn't a matter of some kind of balancing of governmental authority versus private interest or whatever. It's just, Second Amendment doesn't protect them at all. That struck me, that very recent case, that struck me as probably the most extreme thing that's ever come out of the judiciary. Well, that case actually went on a petition for certiorari to the Supreme Court. The title of the case is Colby, K-O-L-B-E, versus Hogan. Hogan's the governor of Maryland. Colby was one of the plaintiffs. He's a private individual that was challenging this assault rifle ban on the theory that he wanted to buy an assault rifle to protect himself, the theory that was upheld for handguns, at least, in the famous Heller case, and then the follow-on, the McDonald case where the Supreme Court ruled that the Second Amendment protected a person's right to have a handgun for personal protection in his home. Well, the Fourth Circuit didn't accept that because they said, well, this is a weapon of war. I thought this was fascinating because, of course, the Second Amendment is designed not to protect rifles or shotguns or whatever used for hunting or for target shooting, or even so much for protection of a person in a person's home. It is designed to be sure that people have those firearms which will enable them to perform a militia function. That's the key to the whole matter. Well, in any event, I filed an amicus brief with the Supreme Court when the petition for certiorari was filed. And interestingly enough, I sent a letter to the President of the United States, to Mr. Trump. And I pointed out to Mr. Trump the decision of the Fourth Circuit was essentially saying that Maryland could prevent the citizens of Maryland, and by the Fourth Circuit's decision, you could have a statute like that in any of the states in the Fourth Circuit, Maryland, Virginia, West Virginia, South Carolina, North Carolina. And that would prevent those individuals from being capable of being called forth by the President of the United States as members of the militia, all right? Because they couldn't possibly be armed with the firearms that would enable them to perform that particular function. And I asked him to get the Solicitor General to file an amicus brief with the Supreme Court, urging the Supreme Court to hear the case. The petition certiorari is just a request for the Supreme Court to hear the case. They're not actually deciding it on that point. They're just saying, well, we'll hear it or not. And of course, or perhaps I shouldn't say of course, but my attitude is that, yeah, of course, the Trump administration people did nothing. All right? Mm-hmm. So the upshot of it was that notwithstanding that there were a large number, I think there were 6 or 8 amici briefs filed. It was an important case. Supreme Court didn't take it. And I thought that was fascinating because at the time, of course, they had Gorsuch had just been appointed. So they had a potential 5-4 split on the court. The 4 conservatives and Kennedy, because Kennedy, if you recall, voted in the Heller case in favor of Scalia's opinion, in favor of the Second Amendment. And then, of course, the 4 liberals on the other side, right? And I think what happened up there is, it's interesting that let me give you a little bit background of the Supreme Court. When a petition for certiorari comes to the Supreme Court, it's a request that the court hear the case. And if any 4 members of the court say, yes, we ought to hear this case, then the petition is granted. You don't have to have 5. Now, it may turn out when the court actually hears the case, it will rule against the petitioners, but it only takes 4. It's called the rule of 4. So if those people on the Supreme Court, the 4 liberals, thought that they could get a decision in favor of what the Fourth Circuit had done, they would have been able to take the case. If the 4 conservatives had thought that they could get a decision overturning the Fourth Circuit, that is, a decision in favor of the Second Amendment, they would have voted to take the case would have been heard. And here was Kennedy in the middle. And I think that shows you how interestingly split the Supreme Court is on this issue. Although either the conservatives or the liberals could have forced that case to be heard, neither one of them was willing to do it because they couldn't be sure where Kennedy would flip. And that's where you think the people who are listening to this, that's what your Second Amendment rights at the Supreme Court level now depend upon, which way Kennedy will flip. Now, he may retire because he said, well, not too long ago, that he was getting, old and he wanted to leave and retire. So Trump may have an opportunity to put another justice on the Supreme Court. But we've seen in the past how justices that appeared to be conservative during their nomination time change their tune when they get on the court. Souter was a good example of that.
Right.
He was promoted as someone who was relatively conservative. No sooner does he get in the court and he's, as liberal as Douglas or Brennan or what have you. So this is my interest now because we're seeing more and more in this country the kind of social dislocations and the possibility of economic crises and so forth and so on that are going to depend in the final analysis along the lines of having people well organized in their local communities in order to deal with these problems. And that's the one thing we don't have, which the constitutional militia structure is really designed to provide for us. Congress dropped the ball on that way back in 1903. So basically you have nothing organized in this country. In fact, the vast majority of people, all the people who aren't in the National Guard, for instance, have been consigned by congressional statute and state statutes that follow on with that to what they call the unorganized militia. Well, it's exactly that. It's unorganized. It's a bunch of people. They're in this category, but they do nothing. They have no training. They have no equipment. They have no role to play. And the classic example now is you look at these Homeland Security programs that are out there through FEMA and other agencies, and they have provided for a thing called CERT, C-E-R-T, Community Emergency Response Teams. And they are FEMA's answer to the problem that you need some kind of organization of the average person where he lives and works in order to deal with serious emergencies of almost any kind, whether it's a natural disaster, hurricane, whatever, tornado, or industrial accident, or pandemics. You can think of all sorts of situations. And so FEMA has promoted this. Well, here's an example. I live in a place called Warren County, Virginia, which is almost as far out in Virginia to the west as you can get. We're like a stone's throw away from West Virginia. And we have about 33,000, 34,000 people in this county. It's what I would call semi-rural. A lot of small farms out here. And our biggest town is called Front Royal. It's got essentially 1.5 main streets, and that's it. And so you would think that the people out here would be independent and self-reliant and so forth and so on. I think to a large extent that's true. But our CERT team, the organized unit that we have in this county to support the EMTs, the emergency people, fire people, 9/11 responders, which are a small number of people to begin with. They only have a few professionals there. But this is the citizens organization to support those people. Out of 33,000, let's divide that. Out of 16,000 adults, say we have 16,000 adults in this county. How many people do you think there are on this team on paper?
I have no idea.
Well, 25 on paper, or 26, 27. That's on paper. That's people who have signed up at one point or another. When you actually go to the meetings on the regular basis, well, it's maybe 6, 8 people will show up. And it's always the same people. All right? So that's the difficulty here. We have a very complex society which depends upon a great deal of interdependent relationships, which if they break down in an emergency, will cause all sorts of havoc. And basically, at the local level, we're totally unprepared to deal with this. We look to either some agencies at the state level, and there aren't that many of those, or ultimately to these agencies in the all-seeing eye in the pyramid, at the apex of the pyramid, Department of Homeland Security and FEMA. And, of course, if you think about it from a constitutional perspective, that's completely upside down. I mean, Homeland Security, to use that word, I don't like that term, it's the one that's popular. Homeland Security is something that works from the bottom up, not from the top down, because problems always occur at the local level. They always affect local people. Those people and those places are the victims of that problem. And if they're not prepared to deal with it initially, if they're not the real first responders in any circumstance, inevitably they're going to be in trouble over the long range. And it's impossible to organize a system from the top down that can possibly deal with all the myriad problems just of organization at the local levels, because they don't have the information. Right? Information filters up from where? From where it's developed, which is at the base. And slowly but surely it filters up to the top. Not all of it gets there. Not all of it gets there in an ungarbled fashion. And then somebody at the top has to interpret it who doesn't have a real sort of hands-on appreciation for what's going on at the bottom. And that's why the thing is, to use a street phrase, screwed up beyond all possibility of redemption, the present system that we have. So look at the Second Amendment. The Second Amendment is not simply about somebody having a gun in his basement to defend himself against a home invasion, or, heaven forbid, defend himself, against some tyrannical government that will send secret police agents to arrest him in the middle of the night. No, it's about organizing people in malicious structures, one aspect of which is the paramilitary or military defense of your locality and your state and ultimately your country. But the other aspect of those malicious structures would be that they would deal with all of the other problems that would arise potentially. And you look at the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 15. Congress has delegated the power to provide for calling forth the militia. And what's the first authority and responsibility of the militia the Constitution sets out? Calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union. All right? The militia are a law enforcement agency. And that execution might involve criminal laws. It might involve laws dealing with natural disasters. I mean, there's a whole spectrum of activities that fall within the concept, the laws of the Union. That's Congress's power at the national level. And, of course, the Constitution makes clear that the militia are the militia of the several states, which they were when the Constitution was ratified. These things actually existed. They weren't created by the states. They weren't created by Congress. I mean, you go back in colonial history, you'll find them back from the 1600s on. As each colony was created, approved by the monarch in England, authority was given to the monarch's friends to go off and set up this colony, and they were given charters, and the charters all have some statement about how they're supposed to raise, train, and equip and so forth the people living in the plantations, as the term was used, in order to defend those plantations against, well, the Indians, against the French, against the Spanish, against pirates. I mean, they had a lot of problems. So it started way back in the colonial period, the very beginning of these colonies, and it went through a developmental process in the early days, and eventually all the colonies adopt the same basic structure. And that structure was dependent upon the concept that everyone in society, all free, able-bodied males, because they had slaves, and they couldn't arm the slaves, and they had women, and women were in a different legal situation than men. They had some duties with respect to the militia, but they were primarily financial. All able-bodied free men from 16 on up until you were essentially disabled by old age had a legal duty to do something to protect and serve their colony, or later their state. This was the basic principle. And they were all organized and trained. Now, in those days, it was mostly paramilitary or military training, because their major problem was, of course, the Indians and basically the French, right? So they were engaged in a lot of military operations in conjunction with the British Army, their army, because of course it was part of the British Empire, so it was their regular army. All right. Now, today, as you see the development of this, you would say, well, we're going to put into play all of these other problems that we have for which we don't have organized solutions. And one that I think of right away, let's tie these two things together: school shootings. All right. School shootings occur. The primary reason, I think, is because you have gun-free school zones. All right. These are free fire zones. If you're someone who is mentally defective or enraged in some way or on psychotropic drugs or whatever, you're probably not going to go in and choose to shoot up a police station because they're all armed. You're going to look for a theater, you're going to look for a school, you're going to look for a shopping center or whatever that has that gun-free logo on the door, or that you recognize the gun-free school zone. So the problem really is, how do you make those schools into gun-protected schools? And, of course, that's where the militia concept comes in. Because all of those teachers, all of those administrators, at least most of them, the teachers and the administrators, and if you're talking about colleges and universities, some of the students as well, would be, if the system were properly enforced, would be members of the militia. And they would have some level of community duty as such, right? And one of the things that could be done quite easily would be to take those people, at least some of them, and train them. I mean, what security functions are performed in a school against a school shooter, all of those protocols and instructional plans and so forth, they've been worked out by the police. You can find that in police academies. You can find that in a lot of private training academies that the average citizen can go to. He can learn those techniques. And so that could easily be done. It would be done under the cloak, umbrella authority of the militia structure. So it would not be a matter of simply saying, well, a private teacher can carry a gun concealed in the schools. No, there'd be a lot more training that would be involved there than simply giving someone a concealed carry permit. But I've never heard anyone come out with that suggestion, that really obvious suggestion, when you think about what the purpose of the militia ought to be. Well, I came out with a suggestion. I think if people go to my website in a few days, edwinvieira.com, they'll find an article that will have just been posted that lays out how President Trump could do this. He doesn't have to wait for something coming out of the states. He doesn't have to wait for something coming out of Congress. There is already a statute that enables him to deal with domestic violence of all sorts. School shooting certainly falls into that category. And it says specifically that he can use the militia to suppress domestic violence by taking whatever steps that he considers necessary. So if I was sitting in somewhere in the White House, I could literally draft the executive order that would solve this problem. Now, it wouldn't solve it overnight. It would set up a mechanism for doing so. Obviously, we have to train people, and steps had to be taken. But the basic problem would be solved. Here's how we address it. All right? Here's what we're going to do. And it could all be done out of the White House through an executive order. And the problem we have in this country, the so-called gun rights groups, they don't know a Second Amendment from a hole in the wall. They really don't understand anything about this. They're fixated on this idea of the individual right. I have an individual right to keep a gun in my house. And they've gotten to the point, at least, where they recognize, well, this is an individual right supposed to protect you against tyranny. But please tell me how I'm going to be protected against tyranny. Because every tyrant has a well-organized police force, special force of some kind that he can use to tyrannize. The tyrants don't come individually to tyrannize. They have armed myrmidons tyrannizing for them. How am I going to protect myself against that kind of a system simply by having a gun in my cellar? It's an absurdity. All right, absolute absurdity. It's only through organization and legal authority that you can stand up against, tyranny, usurpation, any of these misuses of governmental authority. And that's where the gun rights organizations all fall down. They don't look at that 13-word clause, first clause in the Second Amendment, which tells us ultimately why this right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Because the ultimate purpose of it is this other thing, the security of a free state, which is going to be guaranteed by the well-regulated militia, which consists of all the people who are armed with the appropriate type of arms. Right? Very easy to understand. And the gun rights people have got themselves off into this, what shall I call it, this cul-de-sac, intellectual cul-de-sac, about an individual right. Well, that's fine. If you had a militia structure, everyone who was in it, from 16, not 18, not 21, from 16 years of age, would be armed and trained, all right? And they would all have, except for the conscientious objectors who would be given some other duty, they would all have some kind of military-style firearm, AR-15, whatever, you name the one you choose. But that's what they would all have. And they would all be trained. And the younger ones would be trained in a paramilitary, quasi-military fashion. And then as you got older in the system, you'd perform, you slide into other functions that didn't require quite as much physical dexterity and so forth and so on. Right. So there'd be constant training of people throughout society. And instead of having very small number, as we have here in Warren County, a very small number of EMT personnel, so if we had a real disaster, we'd have to call on EMT people from other adjoining counties, we would have a whole slew of people who were trained to the level at which they could support the professional EMT people that we had on. I think those professional EMT people would be part of the militia. They'd be one subset of the militia structure, just as the police would be a subset of the militia structure. And you have total community organization. That's what we don't have. Right. That's what the Second Amendment, if it were properly interpreted with the militia clauses of the Constitution, would give us. And that's what we're going to discover is a great, a great detriment in the future. Because we are going to face economic crises. You can't look at the impossible debt structure of this country and the total irresponsible behavior of the Federal Reserve System and believe for one instant that you're not, in my lifetime, in your lifetime, we're not going to see some major banking and financial crises.
Right.
Of course that's going to happen, right? And every year we have hurricanes on the East Coast, and every year we have tornadoes in the Midwest. I mean, think of all these natural disasters. We're just waiting for an industrial accident along the lines of, what was the one in India, Bhopal? Where Union Carbide, all the isocyanate gas escaped and killed how many people? Right? We're waiting for one of those, or perhaps a Fukushima-type event with a nuclear power plant, right? Or perhaps some major quake on the West Coast. And you think of all these areas, and you think of Montana, I suppose, as well. I don't know what catastrophe you could imagine for Montana. Naturally.
Yellowstone Park blowing up.
Yeah, but the point is, are you any better organized in Montana than we are in Warren County, Virginia?
Right. Edwin, we've got a commercial break coming up. I want to get back to your thoughts on this, but we're going to step into a commercial break. We'll be back in a few minutes.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free. It was the envy of the world. But the shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray. They say we need to spread the word.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. Today we have Edwin Vieira, constitutional expert, and we're talking about the Second Amendment. We're going to get into some areas here that are very, I think, very important, because we've got this school shooting thing right in front of us right now. And I know that, Edwin, you talked about the CERT program. I actually, as a county commissioner, participated in that program. And I can tell you that every aspect of that program is designed to bring in some sort of federal assistance into the process. So it's not even remotely militia-directed, even though I think that was the original intent of it. And I know we've got probably a perfect template of how effective a militia structure is in the country of Switzerland, who's never been invaded by an outside invader, and every citizen certainly every male citizen, and I think every citizen is expected to have some training and to have a weapon in their home and to be ready to respond if they are invaded or in case of any kind of a military insurrection or anything like that. So that's a perfect template, and I believe that was much of what our founding fathers were using as a template when they put together our well-regulated militia verbiage of the Second Amendment. Go ahead with that.
Well, if you look at that language, it goes all the way back in colonial history to, as I said earlier, the original colonial charters. They really didn't need to look to Switzerland, because England had a system of yeomanry militia that went back well into the Middle Ages. So you could really abstract what went on in the American historical context from anything else in the world. You could say, well, okay, they invented this at the time of the original planting of the colonies, and then within a couple of decades, the various statutes and ordinances came out as the legislative bodies were created in those places, and they followed the same pattern all the way through the 1700s. And of course, that's what the term well-regulated militia means. That's what the term militia of the several states means. You look to the entities that existed at that time. Those people were not living in a vacuum. They were very familiar with those concepts because they were living with them. I mean, every adult male at the time the Constitution was ratified was either in one of the state militias, or he had been and now he was too old, or he had been and now he's disabled, or whatever, but he had some relationship to those entities. Now, you mentioned, FEMA. I mentioned FEMA, of course, and it's in a sense it's logical. I mean, from the top down, they're looking and they say, well, we need to have some kind of organization here to deal with these types of problems. Hurricane Katrina, for instance, a good example, right? But we want to control it from the all-seeing eye in the pyramid.
Right.
This is the way the bureaucrats think. So we're going to send down the directives. We're going to send down the planning. We're going to send down the protocols for training. We're going to send down everything that relates to certification. You remember one of these cert teams, you have to be certified in this and certified in that, and you go out online, take this course, take that course, whatever it is. All of it coming from the all-seeing eye. And that's because they want control. That's their word, control, right? They don't want bottom-up organization, because bottom-up organization implies, ultimately, bottom-up control. When the real crisis comes, if the people at the bottom can deal with that situation, they don't need to be told what to do from some bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. And the bureaucrats' view of the world is that everyone needs to be told what to do from some bureaucracy in Washington, D.C. And see, that's our problem. Our Constitution was built, if you look at the pyramidal structure, you say, yes, it's a pyramid. Right, at the bottom, you have the people in their localities. In the middle, you have the state governments. Way at the top, you have this thing called the federal government, really the general government. The whole structure is a federal government. And the bureaucrats think of this as power flowing from the bottom up, and all power is then centralized in the all-seeing eye. And the all-seeing eye then radiates directives down to the bottom. But anybody who understands architecture knows that the strength of the pyramid is not in the apex, it is in the base, right? And that's the true federal system in this country. The strength of the system is supposed to be in the base, in the people who are what? The sovereigns, right? Republican form of government is one in which the people themselves are the sovereigns, right? And the people at the top have been delegated certain limited authority to deal with situations which, for practical purposes, the bottom level can't deal with. So we give international relations to the people at the top of the pyramid, because you can't have international relations being decided willy-nilly by all sorts of people around in the bottom of the pyramid, right? But in terms of security, which the Second Amendment calls security of a free state, well, who is most concerned about that? Well, it's the people living in that free state, right? You want the security is the thing that their lives depend upon. And, of course, the Second Amendment says, well, what's necessary to the security of the free state? A well-regulated militia. And why should that be true? Well, because a well-regulated militia is composed of the people themselves. They provide, ultimately, their own security. And that's the only way to have the security of what? A free state, as opposed to a police state or a totalitarian state or a welfare state or a Bolshevik state or whatever other kind of state some bureaucrat thinks ought to be imposed. And yet we have in this country, and it's a sad situation, so many people who are constitutionalists and patriots and so on, they call themselves that, who simply refuse to see this point. That you are not going to have a free state unless you yourself are in control of some significant aspect of the security of that state. And if you essentially abscond from your duties and you acquiesce in a takeover by bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., then it won't be very long until you not only don't have a free state, but you have no possibility of regaining a free state. And I think the people in FEMA, and there are probably some people up there who are not neo-Bolsheviks, and they look at this situation and they say, gosh, we really do need to have some kind of organization at the local, state and local levels. And so they provide all this material. But the interesting thing about it is they haven't provided the wherewithal to cause people to become educated and enthusiastic about participating in these structures FEMA has created. As I say about Warren County, where we got like 6 or 8, 10 people come to the meetings. That's the certainty. If you had a militia structure here, let's say we got 16,000 adults, you'd have in principle 16,000 people. Some of them you could give exemptions to for one reason or another. But say we only had 5 or 10%, 15% of 16,000 people. Well, that's quite a bit more than 8 or 10. Right. And the point would be, because we have the CERT team here, it's all voluntary. The point with the militia is, and always was, that every member of the community, by living in that community, has some duty to that community. We're all in this together, all right? There are no people that can simply stand aside and say, well, we don't believe that we need to participate in this. Wrong. Everyone, just like Switzerland, everyone not only needs to participate, they are required to participate to some degree. Right. And I think of the conscientious objectors as a classic example during the colonial period of independent states. All of the militia structures, statutes, acts, ordinances, whatever they call them, they dealt with the conscientious objectors. They said, okay, you don't have to have a gun. You're a Quaker, you're a Mennonite, you don't believe in the use of firearms. You don't have to have a gun, but we'll make you do something else.
Right, you can cook, or you can clean, or you can do something. Or
you can buy a gun for something. You can provide funds.
Yeah.
Or the classic example, I think, of this is, and a number of statutes had this provision, that the conscientious objectors would not serve in a quasi-military capacity, but they would do such things, protective things as take the women and children to safety, or take the cattle to safety when the village was attacked. Or they would serve as scouts and spies. Now that's fascinating because even the French, colonists, the British were fighting the French. A militiaman, if he was captured by the French, he would be treated as a prisoner of war, right, because he was performing a soldierly function. Mm-hmm. But what if they captured a conscientious objector who was serving as a spy? What was the penalty for espionage? Still is. Mm-hmm. Death. Remember Nathan Hale? I have one life to give to my country is my only regret. Where they hanged him, right? It was death. So if you were a conscientious objector in the militia under those statutes, you could be in more trouble than the average militiaman. All right? So in any event, they had everybody participating, even the women, because an individual in the militia had to buy his own gun, generally speaking. If he was too poor, the town or the militia, somebody would provide a gun. But if he could provide the gun for himself, he had to do that. It was his own gun. He kept it at home, and he could be fined if it were not in proper condition, ready to be used. Well, if you were an apprentice or you were a minor child, a child under the age of 21, and you're living at home, it's probably unlikely in most places that you would have had enough money to buy your own gun. So who was responsible then? Well, your father was, or your master, if you were an apprentice. Right? Well, what happened if the father was dead? Well, then the mother was responsible, and so the mother had to pay. So the women had certain financial obligations with respect to the militia. I mean, nobody got out of this, the simple way of putting it, unless you were disabled. If you could not perform a function, then you were excluded. But otherwise, you were included. And that was it. You had some function to perform. And the only ones who didn't perform what I would call a quasi-military function were certain people in public office and certain private occupations. And that was because the consensus was that those offices were so important to be filled, and those private occupations were so important to have someone doing them, that those people could receive exemption from normal militia service. So, for instance, private occupation, if you were the ferryman, you were exempted. Why? Because the ferry was a vital part of the communication network. You had to have someone there who knew how to run it. If you were a miller, you were typically exempted. Why? Because those were semi-agricultural societies, and the mill was very important to the maintenance of the commercial operation, grinding wheat and barley and so forth and so on. Typically, if you were a physician or surgeon, you were exempted, except when, of course, the militia was called up, and then you'd go with the militia because you were needed. Right? So there, and in the slave states, if you were an overseer of more than so many slaves, you were exempted, for the simple reason that the slave system required that kind of control. So they had thought all of this through, but the basic proposition was everyone owed some duty to everyone else in the community, and that was going to be fulfilled through this militia structure. And that's what we've completely lost here. Mm-hmm. We have a kind of uber-libertarian view that, well, I'm just going to do my own thing, and the devil take the hindmost. And I don't owe anything to anybody else here, and maybe there are some onerous things that are being imposed on me by the government, and I have to pay this tax or that tax or whatever it is. But I look askance at that. I really don't owe anything in the sense of my personal participation. I may have to pay some money, but my personal participation with some other people in some kind of operation, I'm not going to be a part of that. Right? And that's the problem. Because the only thing that maintains a free state, a free society, is that kind of commitment of people. Right? I'm committed to maintaining this structure, not only for myself, but for you, because we're all in this together in our own locality. If I go or you go, all the rest of us go too. It was Ben Franklin's statement, right? If we don't all hang together, we shall surely hang separately. Mm-hmm. Well, basically, that's true. And we don't have that ethos anymore. That's the thing that is certainly not taught in schools. That's the thing that the politicians really do not press on. Politicians press on us identity politics. Right? You belong to this race, and so you should vote this way. You belong to this sex, and so you should vote that way. You belong to this group. You're a wager, you're a blue-collar worker, you're a white-collar worker, whatever it is. They break people up in antagonistic groups in order, as Bill Clinton used to say, to triangulate them in order to gain votes, to get elected. Yep. Instead of standing on the platform that no matter what race, what sex, what age, what occupation you are, we are all in this in a common enterprise. And we may have certain conflicts. That's a necessary part of the human condition, right? Because we're not perfect. We may have certain conflicts. But there's a bigger picture that we have to see. And there's a bigger structure that we have to maintain. And if we don't do this, we're going down the drain, or we're going to hell without a handbasket. It's the best way to describe it.
Edwin, what it boils down to is personal responsibility, which is an absolutely integral part of the concept of freedom in our country, which is individualism over collectivism, but with the understanding that we all have individual responsibility and that we are there to, let's say, participate as a group to make sure that we take care of what needs to be taken care of.
Well, it's a concept of self-government. Right? Self-government doesn't simply mean me governing myself. It means me cooperating with other people in governing our community. And the reality of the situation is, if you don't have self-government, if you don't organize to govern your community, somebody else is going to come along to govern you. Right? Anarchy is simply something that you don't see in the real world. All right, anarchistic societies. I mean, Spain had a good example of that in the 1930s. Huge anarchist groups and trade unions, and they were part and parcel of the forces on the left in the Spanish Civil War. And in that period of time, they were taken over eventually by the communists and controlled completely. And that was the one experiment in the 20th century completely failed. So you have self-government. You're governing yourself. If you refuse to do that, for whatever reason, someone else is going to come along to govern you, and they're there. They're there in the state capitals. They're there in Washington, D.C., right? We don't have to wait for these people to show up. We can feel their hot breath on our necks every day. Right. And it's all because we refuse to take up that burden at the local level and ultimately the state level and say, well, wait a minute, we can do this better than, to come back to our original example, we can do this better than FEMA. We don't need you. We can govern ourselves with respect to emergency preparedness. Let's leave the militia word out because that scares a lot of people. With respect to emergency preparedness, we can do this at the local level, and all the local levels can combine. We can do this at the state level. We don't need directives coming out of Washington, D.C. If you want to provide some information for us as to how the state should cooperate in larger projects, feel free to do so, and then our legislature and our governor will decide the extent to which we want to become involved in those kinds of compacts under Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3 of the Constitution. But don't tell us what we need to do at the local level. You don't really know, and you don't really care, but we do. And until we start taking that attitude, adopting that attitude, and telling these people in Washington, D.C. in particular, that we really don't need them, they are going to do the thing that bureaucrats always do. They're going to expand like bacteria on the Petri dish, right? And absorb as much control over as much of society as society lets them have.
Right.
I mean, world history shows this over and over and over again with centralized governmental structures. They are the ultimate parasites. In fact, they're worse than parasites because they end up killing the host. A smart parasite doesn't kill the host, just sucks blood from it or whatever. But that happens over. It's human nature in those kinds of bureaucratic top-down structures to want to expand the ambit of their control and want to expand the depth of their control. So they get right down to that individual, right? And that's the opposite of any rational conception of a free society. Right, from the ancient Greeks to the founding fathers. I mean, you're not going to find anyone who equates a free society with that kind of control mechanism. It's ridiculous. But that's what we have now. And if you look at it, well, why has this happened? It's because the ultimate check and balance is Joe Sixpack, in a sense. It's that guy down there at the local level, the man who will just say no, to quote Nancy Reagan. Right? Just say no to drugs and alcohol. Just say no to bureaucratic control. Just say no to domination from Washington. Just say no to the all-seeing eye. But you can't just say no unless you have an alternative.
Right.
And that's where they have us, because they've taken away the militia structure. They did that from 1903 on, and so we have no organized operational structure with some kind of governmental authority built into it at the local level to deal with these problems. So, of course, we come hat in hand to someone at a higher level of the system, higher up in the pyramid. Well, we go to Richmond here in Virginia, go to the state capitol. And the state capitol, of course, well, all those guys want to become congressmen or senators, so they, of course, go to Washington, D.C. And pretty soon we discover that the only information that we have dealing with emergency services has been developed by FEMA. And in order to be a part of one of these programs, you have to take a FEMA course online, be certified in all this jargon that they put out. I mean, you've probably taken those courses.
Oh, yeah, absolutely, yep.
I mean, they're incredible, absolutely incredible. Well, I spent 12 hours doing this. What the hell did I really learn? Well, some kind of organizational chart that these people draw up. I mean, they love to do that. Organizational charts. What's really needed is hands-on training. Right? I'm a firearms instructor. I can show people all the pictures of firearms and how they work and so forth and so on all day long, but what really gets it into someone's head is when you get something into his hands.
Right, out on the range.
You put that revolver in his hands, you put that semi-automatic pistol in his hands, you put that assault rifle, oh my goodness, assault rifle in his hands, and now you have the real kind of training, right? And this is the problem. So you can read all of this stuff that comes out of FEMA. You can have the bookshelves loaded with 3-ring binders of these FEMA protocols. Where's the bloody training? Where are the people in the field doing this? Where's the local organization? And the reality is, well, FEMA doesn't give a damn about that, the ultimate analysis. Right? Right. Because if they did, we'd have it. Right? And the real reason they don't give a damn is because if we had it, we could just say no. You see, it's a vicious circle, isn't it? From their point of view, they probably have a real interest in not having a lot of people die in New Orleans as a result of hurricanes, right? But on the other hand, they have a real interest in not having people in New Orleans being able to take care of themselves when hurricanes strike. Right?
Exactly. That's why they were disarming them.
Yeah, okay. And so which comes first? The altruistic view of we want to help people from the top down, or the selfish view, we want to control people from the top down. And history always shows that although these things may begin and they may have a strain of altruism and civic concern built into them, the bureaucracies are always about control. Control. And if it causes you to die, that's too bad. You didn't follow the FEMA protocol, you die, tough luck for you. That's the attitude. And I'm not saying that this is what they're thinking consciously, but if you look at the way the structure operates, some people died. A lot of people died in Katrina. Why? Because they weren't prepared. Their locality failed them, their state government failed them, and Washington, D.C. failed them. And then when the crisis struck, and they knew the crisis was coming, they knew approximately how bad it would be, they knew that New Orleans is basically below sea level, right? They knew all of this. When FEMA showed up, what did they do? As you said, they sent people around to confiscate guns. All right? Yeah. Instead of having a large number of people, I mean, how many people are there living in New Orleans? But you got a large number of people in New Orleans who were trained properly in the militia, who could have dealt with any looters or other disorderly people. Right? They sent in a bunch of thugs to beat up the old woman in her kitchen to take her little revolver away from her. You've seen that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. All right. So there's the reality of the situation. They have totally fouled this up in Washington. They've pretty much totally fouled it up in every state capital, because if you look at every state, you don't find any of this local organization that's worth, spit in a bucket.
Well,
Nothing.
And when they do, Edwin, when they do get a militia group that forms to try to do that function, they demonize them as being a bunch of nutcases, in that they're somehow antisocial. They're against society.
Oh, sure. The Southern Poverty Law Center immediately lists them as a hate group,
right?
Or extremist, or whatever terminology they're using these days. And what's the reason for that? Well, these groups that call themselves militia groups are really not militia groups, because a militia group has to be part of the governmental structure.
Right.
There were no private militias in the colonial period, for the obvious reason that everyone was in the militia. Right? So you couldn't have. There couldn't have been a competing group.
Edwin, we've got to get into a commercial break, but we'll be back on the other side of the hour, and we'll continue this.
Great.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution.
You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
There was a mighty nation, blessed above all of creation. It was a rare and precious pearl, conceived in faith and liberty, home of the brave, land of the free, the envy of the world. But this shining city on a hill has turned from the Creator's will and let evil take control. Now the reckless men who lead them want to strip away their freedom and to steal their very soul. Now it's smoke and mirrors, switching bait, criticize and confiscate and let the guilty walk away. In this once righteous, godly nation, in the halls of education, they forbid a child to pray.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and our guest today is Edwin Vieira, and Edwin is a constitutional expert, and we are talking about the Second Amendment. I do want to mention, before we get into the discussion further, that Debbie Boscalupi's Radioactive Wednesday, which she will have really good guests on tomorrow talking about what's going on in California and some of the control mechanisms that are going into that area. So I want to definitely ask our listeners to please tune in to Debbie's show, Radioactive Wednesday, and we'll continue with that. So, Edwin, we were talking about the Second Amendment in militias, but let's talk about some of the groups and the individuals that are the most vocal and supportive of gun control, and how these groups are operating and why they're funded the way they are, and what their ultimate purpose is.
Well, you can think of some names. You think of Bloomberg, a multimillionaire from New York who finances a great deal of gun control activism. Think of groups that, of course, George Soros finances. You can think of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Go down the list. Some of these people, I suppose, are what you'd call, well, the term useful idiots comes to mind. They're people that honestly believe, on the basis of really no empirical evidence, that somehow society would be better off if no one but the police and the military have firearms. And of course, this abstracts from the U.S. Constitution, because there's this thing called the militia out there, which is everybody else, which is supposed to have firearms. But they leave us. See, nobody talks about that. Nobody talks about the United States Constitution here. They talk about some kind of vacuum, intellectual vacuum. But there are some people who honestly believe, yes, if we didn't have any firearms, everything, we could all sit around the campfire and sing Kumbaya, and we'd all be happy. But I think that the main thrust of this is the people who understand very well that you cannot have a top-down, totally bureaucratically controlled society that is really tightening the screws on people, that is doing things to people that they don't like. If there is any possibility that once the screws get tightened down to the last thread, the people will rebel in an effective manner. And that isn't simply by tweeting that they don't like it, but rising up in active resistance. And active resistance, of course, depends upon those people being armed in some way. And so this is the theory and practice of all totalitarian governments. This government gets in, and it seems to be benign, and one of its first steps is to start disarming the population. Pretty soon it's got the population entirely disarmed, and then it turns malignant. And the population discovers, oh, too late, now we're on the way to the camps, we're on the way to the gulags, we're on the way to the Laogai, whatever the system is, and there's nothing we can do about it because they convince us to give up our means of resistance. Right. And, of course, that's what's written into the first 13 words of the Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state. The concept is, if you don't have a well-regulated militia, the security of a free state is endangered, and what is the alternative to a free state? I mean, you can put whatever adjective you want in there, a police state, a totalitarian state, a Bolshevik state, a Maoist state, whatever, but it's something that the average person, one would think, does not want to have imposed upon him. I think the average person probably wants to live in a state approximating a free state, even though he may not understand the historical basis, or philosophical basis, or legal basis for that, but he knows how he wants to live. And there are people out there who don't want you to live that way. They want you to live the way they want you to live, and that's it. And if you don't do that, they're going to impose some kind of stringent top-down control on you, ultimately take you to prison or worse. And, of course, they're afraid that at some stage, people will simply respond in a negative fashion to that kind of pressure, and they don't want them to have the means to do so. And I think this is a classic example of in the Colby case and this Maryland statute. The Maryland statute was a typical Clinton gun control, assault rifles ban type statute. And they have something similar to that in Connecticut. They have something similar to that in New York. Those were upheld on a different basis. But in the Maryland case, a specific argument was made by the state of Maryland. These guns, AR-15s and the various AK-47 types, and a whole slew of semi-automatic rifles, these guns are, quote-unquote, weapons of war. And the average person should not be allowed to have a weapon of war. Well, the whole theory of a free state is that the average person is required to have a weapon of war. He's supposed to defend the free state against whatever enemies may appear. And they usually appear in a domestic fashion, more dangerously than a foreign fashion, right? Because the domestic ones, you don't understand that they are your enemies for a while. Foreign armies, you can tell, well, hey, they're coming in landing craft or whatever. But the domestic enemies are like termites in the house. You don't see them, but they're undermining the entire foundation much more effectively than some foreign army that you can beat off, the invasion at the beaches. So here was the predicate of this argument made by the state of Maryland, and one would have thought that 14 judges in a circuit court in the United States would say, well, no, that isn't right, because the Second Amendment certainly doesn't allow for that type of argument. We'll find some other way to do this. That's what they did in New York. That's what they did in Connecticut. The Second Circuit ruled that those statutes were valid because, well, there was a public interest of compelling state interest in controlling criminal use of these arms. Double talk. They used double talk. But the Fourth Circuit didn't use double talk. It straightforwardly said, these are weapons of war, and the Second Amendment does not protect them at all. All right? Now, that tells me how far we've gone. You can't read the Second Amendment, and you can't tie the Second Amendment into the militia clauses of the original Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Clauses 15 and 16, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. You can't tie those things together, especially with the history in the colonial period and the period of the independent states of the militia, the militia of the several states, as the Constitution calls. You cannot look at any of this. No rational person can look at this and say, wait a minute, the Second Amendment is not about people having, quote-unquote, weapons of war. It's just the opposite. All right? So here you had 14 judges, well, 10 out of the 14, because 4 of them dissented, but 10 out of the 14 were willing to say, oh, no, Second Amendment doesn't have anything to do with what the Second Amendment has to do with. So where the heck are we with a judicial system can put up 10 judges who will say that? And then the Supreme Court, for whatever reason, didn't take certiorari in this case, didn't decide to hear the case because of, I think, of the own internal politics in the Supreme Court of the United States. And one would think if any Second Amendment case were worthy of being heard, it was this one. And then the President of the United States himself, I mean, if I were the President of the United States, I would have said, wait a minute, what they're trying to do in Maryland is to prevent me from using the citizens of Maryland to execute all of these laws out there that actually talk about my ability to use a militia. Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 253. Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 252. I go down the list of these laws, right? That's what this law is doing. This Maryland law is doing. I've got to come into this case and point out to the courts that this is an attack on my ability to perform my function as Commander-in-Chief of the militia of the several states we call in the actual service of the United States, Article 2, Section 2, Clause 1. Well, did he do that? No. Did someone over in the Department of Justice do that? Well, no, they were conspiring against him. They're trying to get him on some, Russian collusion theory, so they couldn't be worried about this. That's what I find fascinating. And, of course, the gun rights groups are there to a large extent, too, by default, because no one wants to use that M word. Well, we don't want to talk about the militia because Southern Poverty Law Center will call us extremists. Instead of just saying, well, Southern Poverty Law Center could go to you-know-where. The Southern Poverty Law Center is not the determining factor in constitutional law in this country.
No,
but our problem is we're looking at this from a point of view and a point of reference that may not be here for very much longer. We're talking about the U.S. Constitution, Second Amendment, and we got these people out in the woodwork. The same people, to a large extent, who are promoting radical gun control are promoting this Constitutional Convention of the States.
Right.
I'm willing to bet a stack of Krugerrands as tall as I am that one thing that will go on the table very quickly at that convention will be some amendment or new provision of the Constitution that ends the Second Amendment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree.
And so they're working on a number of fronts. They're working on the judicial front, which, of course, is tied into the legislative front because they need to get a statute passed in order to get that statute in front of the courts, and then the courts rule in favor of it. And they're working on the propaganda front, this whole spew of propaganda, especially on CNN, that came out after the Parkland, Florida shooting. Right. Scripts given to these students. You're supposed to read the script prepared for you by CNN. Right. Mm-hmm. So you've got the professional propagandists out there. And then, of course, you have the Charles Schumers and the Dianne Feinsteins and so forth, your gun control people who have been in the Senate or the House of Representatives for God knows how long, and they're spilling the same story. And NGO after NGO, non-governmental organization, think tank after think tank out there like Southern Poverty Law Center, attacking anyone who says anything favorable about gun control, let alone things like the militia. I mean, you're going to be pilloried. It's like a Salem witch hunt. Unbelievable. And what I find interesting is that the gun proponent, the pro-gun groups, don't stop and think for themselves, wait a minute. The one thing that would guarantee gun possession in this country by the vast majority of people would be getting back to something that looked like the proper historical constitutional militia structure. Because under that structure, everyone who wasn't a conscientious objector was required to have a firearm and to have firearms training. And you might exempt more people today because we have a lot of people, so you might say, well, we'll exempt people who are philosophically opposed. You don't have to be a Quaker, you don't have to be a Mennonite, in the formal sense of a religion, but you could be philosophically opposed to this. And we will exempt you because we don't need you. We have far more people than we actually need to make this structure work. In the colonial period, of course, they didn't. They had to have everybody. But we'll exempt you. But everybody else is going to have a firearm, or at least is going to have this absolute right because it's tied to this duty to have a firearm. Well, that's the end of gun control as we know it today, right? Mm-hmm. George Soros can whistle. Bloomberg can, I don't know what he'll do. But that's the end. And what kind of firearms would they be? Well, initially, the first rank in the choice would be the quasi-military firearms, because you want the militia to be able to perform at least paramilitary functions equivalent to what the Army infantry and Marine infantry can do. That was what they did in the colonial period. They were equivalent to the British infantry or the French infantry. No question. They had artillery as well, for heaven's sakes. Private cannons were owned by private parties. But at least the infantry, so the first line of firearms that would be accessible to people as part of their duty would be these AR-15 types or whatever, the so-called semi-automatic assault rifles. I'm a big fan of semi-automatic assault rifles because, number one, most people who really learn to use them can fire them as fast as an automatic rifle. They don't waste ammunition. So,
Right,
you know, in a sense, the Fourth Circuit is right. They are akin to military firearms, and probably in trained hands they're better. But we leave that aside. In any event, gun control would end. Gun control, as we understand that concept today, would end forever if the militia concept were brought back, even in a shadow of its former form. All right? That would be the end of it. And so I don't understand why, let me just take this group because everybody knows it's the NRA, National Rifle Association, why they aren't proponents of term I use, revitalizing the militia. And it's peculiar because the NRA, if you read their bylaws, they say in the bylaws that one of their purposes is to train people for functioning within the militia, preparing them for duty in the militia. So there's some disconnect there. And I think it's all political, right? You know, they don't want to make too many waves. They don't want to take on maybe an argument that the other side has developed a great deal of ammunition to throw at them. I mean, this all came up in I think it was the Kennedy administration. I remember. See, it shows you how old I am. I remember the John Kennedy administration. A lot of people were saying that Kennedy had around him a bunch of extreme leftist advisors. And maybe that was true to some extent. And so there was a group that formed out your way called the Minutemen. And they claimed to be some kind of militia group. And they were very militant against the Kennedy administration in any event. And so it gave the militia term a bad, I mean, people had been using the militia term earlier, but this thing gave the militia term a bad name in the press. Because remember, Kennedy was the darling of the media. Camelot, right? Jackie O, right? We think of all the, everything that we think about John Kennedy. That this was like some period in American history that was just glorified by the media. So they loved him. So the Minutemen were attacking him, and they considered themselves to be some kind of militia. So the militia term became a negative term. And then eventually you had the Gun Control Act of 1968, Safe Streets Act, as it was originally called, because they had the assassinations of Martin Luther King and they had the assassination of Robert Kennedy. So Johnson gets this thing passed. And the NRA finally came out against gun control, or in favor of what we call gun rights, or they call gun rights, in the early 1970s. They set up a thing called their Legislative Institute for Legislative Action. I think it's a lobbying group, basically. And that's where they started their pro-gun lobbying and public education activity. And they brought online a lot of intellectuals, college professors and writers and so forth and so on, who developed this individual right theory. And I always thought the reason that they developed the individual right theory was because they were afraid of raising the militia aspect of this. They thought that would be negative from a political point of view, propaganda point of view. And so they focused on this individual right. Well, of course, if you're in the militia, you're going to have the individual right to have a gun because you have a duty to have a gun.
Right.
So if you have a duty to have a gun, you must have the right to have the gun. Nobody can take it away from you because you're part of the militia. I mean, it's all a circle, right? Logical circle. But they didn't do it. And so they promoted this individual right concept and eventually got even the Supreme Court to accept it in the Heller case, in Justice Scalia's opinion in the Heller case. And now they're boxed in because if you know anything about intellectuals, they need dump trucks to carry their egos around in back of them. All right? And especially intellectuals in the legal community, lawyers and law professors. Oh, they are the worst of all. And now what are they going to do? They're going to say, well, for the past 35 years or 40 years, we've been talking about the individual right, and that's really not correct. The correct interpretation is this other thing, which is focused on the militia, and of course that protects an individual right, but we really want to focus on the militia. Well, they're going to look like fools, so they're not going to say it. That's the reality of this, right? Nobody wants to backtrack on what he's said on record, especially when he's written articles in intellectual journals, which can be quoted against him. Right? So they don't want to go back on what they've already said. So now we're caught in this kind of quagmire where the Fourth Circuit can come out in the Colby case and say that the Second Amendment doesn't protect the very arms that the Second Amendment is supposed to protect, by every historical meaning and legal meaning of that Second Amendment. And what happens? The NRA is still taking the position, well, these AR-15s are for personal defense at home. Well, the Fourth Circuit said, we don't care about personal defense at home. They're not protected by the Second Amendment because they're weapons of war. Too bad for you. Your whole theory of personal defense goes out the window as soon as we call these things weapons of war. And every gun that you're going to find out there, at one time or other, type of gun at least, and sometimes brand of gun, has been or is being used as a weapon of war. Remington 700 rifles. The military uses them as sniper rifles. Some people in the military do. All right. Typical bolt-action rifle. You can go buy that in any large gun store. That's a weapon of war.
Right. Black powder at one point was a weapon of war.
But certainly the ones that were used in Vietnam, in Korea, in World War II, bolt-action rifles, M1, Garand. So you think of all these are all weapons of war. And 1911 pistols, they've been weapons of war since 1911, right? I mean, go on and on and on about this. Most of your semi-automatic pistols, some police agency uses those, and sometimes they allow the police to choose their own firearm. And so you can look at every one of those. And of course, they're built on the same pattern. So you say, well, that pattern is the thing we want to stop, right? We want to stop a semi-automatic rifle. We want to stop a semi-automatic pistol. Why do we all semi-automatic? Because the Army uses them. The Marines use them, right? Semi-automatic rifles, well, they're full automatic of the Army and the Marines, but same principle. They're akin to, that was the Second Amendment argument made by the Fourth Circuit. They're akin to these weapons of war. All right? So what they've done now, the gun control people have now hit on the ultimate argument. If we can call this thing a weapon of war, or we can call it akin to a weapon of war, or somehow related, in a verbiage that we can doctor up in a judicial opinion, then the Second Amendment doesn't apply to it at all. Forget the NRA. Forget their arguments. Individual right, forget it. That's based upon the Second Amendment. If the Second Amendment doesn't apply at all, it's gone. Possession of that firearm is gone. So the NRA has put itself into an interesting box now, or has been put into that box by the extreme gun control people. The extreme gun control people have hit on this argument, which is quite logical. Right? If the Second Amendment doesn't protect weapons of war, and all these things are akin to weapons of war, then the Second Amendment doesn't protect these things, no matter whether these things could be used for individual self-defense. Follow that? That's the ultimate argument. And they have that. They have 10 out of 14 judges on the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals have agreed with that. And they're going to shop that argument around throughout the country to get whatever legislature they can get to pass one of these prohibition bills, to get whatever, maybe they can do it in locality. Some places, states in states, some counties and cities have the ability to pass their own ordinances, so they'll get it done there. And then get the local courts, state courts, to uphold this Fourth Circuit opinion, maybe get some of the other federal courts to uphold this. Right? And the next thing you know, you're going to have a real divide here. The Second Amendment is going to be on the one side nullified, and on the other side it's only going to be half-heartedly supported by its own proponents. And where that type of thing generally leads is to the victory of the opponents. They have a system of argument that is logically closed. If you follow their argument, they're absolutely right. If you follow the NRA's argument, there's a hole in it. And, of course, the other side is going through that hole. Right? It's like the Titanic. You have a hole in the front, and the ship is going to sink eventually. Right? So this is what I see as the problem. And, of course, the point I made a moment ago, if this convention of the states turns out to be the disaster that I and a number of other people think it will necessarily be,
I agree.
You can be sure that whatever comes out of that, because the purpose of that, I think, is to centralize more power in Washington, not less.
Right.
And one of the things they would love to get rid of is the Second Amendment as a concept. Let's just wipe that off the table. That's what the Fourth Circuit did in the Colby case. It provided an argument for wiping it off the table. And even better than that, why depend just upon a judicial decision? Let's wipe it off the table by putting some kind of amendment or restructuring of the Constitution that eliminates that. Or it could be as simple as giving plenary power to the legislature to ban whatever firearms it wants. It could be simple along that line. I think they'd probably do something a little bit more complex than that, because you can't always trust the legislature. You want to get rid of it entirely. And just as an aside, I mean, a lot of people are naive out there. They think that the members of this Constitutional Convention, the delegates, are going to be Mark Levin and Michael Farris, and these are the people that are going to go to the baloney. The community organizers, the Barack Obama types, are the ones who are going to go to that.
Exactly, and the NGOs and the big foundations and all these groups like that are going to be supporting them.
Well, that's right. And if you think about the process by which the delegates are going to be selected, well, Congress may decide what that is, or the state legislatures may decide, but whatever it is, who is going to have the upper hand in implementing that process? Well, it's going to be the leftist community organizer types in this society. They're the ones who are adept at that. They're the ones who have had the practice. They're the ones that are already planning how they're going to do it.
Exactly.
Our side doesn't have any kind of organization along those lines. And so we think, oh, yes, it's going to be James Madison and so Elbridge Gerry. You think of all the founding fathers who were actually at the Constitution. George Washington Franklin was there. They're going to be there at this new Constitution. Baloney. It's going to be the equivalent of Barney Frank and Chuck Schumer. Those are the people who are going to be there. And if anyone thinks for 1 minute that they are going to come up with some kind of quasi-libertarian or classical liberal or founding fathers type amendments to the Constitution to rein in the power of the very institutions that they're working for, he's living in the worst kind of dream. I mean, he's living in Alice in Wonderland type dream world. That's definitely not going to happen. And people say, well, they can only have, can only propose amendments. You take the Constitution of the United States, how does it begin? We the people of the United States, and then it goes on, right? And their amendment to the Constitution could be, strike all the words after we the people of the United States and insert instead the following. That's an amendment, thank you very much. You see that done all the time with statutes.
Oh, sure.
Right? That's an amendment. You can strike the entirety of the document except for the first 6 words and put in a completely new structure.
Exactly.
And that would pass as an amendment. And then what would happen? Well, someone might come along and say, well, this is what's supposed to happen, and they're not following the rules, blah, 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 blah. Well, the people who are proposing the Constitutional Convention are saying, we need to do this because we can't trust the courts. Right. The courts have allowed all these usurpations. What do they think will happen if the Constitutional Convention goes bad? Will they be able to go to the courts and have it overturned?
Exactly. Edwin, we've got a commercial break coming up. We'll catch the other side of the half-hour break and continue this discussion.
Serving the planet. The Micro Effect. www.themicroeffect.com.
And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence.
It was 1776 when the founders signed the writ of independence from the Brits. It was revolution. Now an enemy from within would enslave us all again and deprive us of our rights in the Constitution. Restore the Republic. Wake up, it's time to understand. Restore the Republic. We're losing our freedom in the land.
Well, welcome back to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel, and today my guest is Edwin Vieira, and we're talking about the Second Amendment, and we're talking about well-regulated militias. But before we get back into our discussion, I want to mention Debbie Boscalupi's Radioactive Wednesday program tomorrow morning at the same time as our program. That would be 9 to 11 Mountain Time. That would be 8 to 10 Pacific Time. And on tomorrow morning's program, Debbie has Dr. Jim Enstrom. He's a UCLA professor and a whistleblower on the EPA and Air Resources Board fraudulent studies that they did on diesel particulate matter for trucks. And also Hank DeCarbonell, an expert on California's Global Warming Solutions Act and its destruction of the California trucking industry. So that ought to be a fascinating discussion. And Debbie is a terrific host, and she's doing a fantastic job, and I hope our listeners will tune in to hear her program. And also, I want to mention the fact that we are now in the process of starting sales on Red Pill Expo tickets. And this year we're doing the Red Pill Expo in Spokane, Washington at the Spokane Convention Center. And the dates on that will be June 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. And I suggest that our listeners, if they're interested in purchasing tickets, they're at a reduced price right now for the early bird specials. And they can go to redpillexpo.org. And on that site, they'll have information on the expo and also on purchasing tickets. And Edwin, I'm hopeful, and I know our group is hopeful that you can be a speaker at that event as well. So we'll get back into our discussion. You know, when I sent out my notice on this radio show, I mentioned in there the deep state and how the left is doing a better job of promoting their agenda than we are on the right. And you're kind of getting into that with this discussion on the Second Amendment. And I appreciate your perceptions on this stuff, so I'll let you flow with that. Thank you.
Well, you know, Dan, I've gone to a lot of conferences during my lifetime, many of them dealing with the question of the financial instability in this country tied to the Federal Reserve System. Some of them dealing with gun rights in general. And the one thing I've found is that people are capable of understanding the problem, but they very infrequently come up with some solution or proposed solution that enough people will get behind to try to make work. So as a result, there's a lot of talk, but in the final analysis, there's very little real action. And the analogy I like to use is you go to the doctor, you know, you go to this big building, has 100 physicians, and you go to the first doctor, he says, well, you know, you have Fenster's syndrome, Mr. Smith, and you've had it for long enough, and it's usually fatal. And let me tell you about the history of this. It was discovered back in 1825, and blah, blah, blah. He goes on, he gives you, 100 years, 150 years worth of history, 200 years worth of history about Fenster's syndrome, and now I have it, and I'm going to die from it. I said, well, doctor, now what can I do? And the doctor says, well, I'm only here to educate you. I'm not going to, prescribe anything. Okay, so I go to the next doctor in the building, and I get the same story. In fact, I go through 50 doctors in the building. They all give me the same story. They're going to educate me about the fact that I have Fenster's syndrome and that it's fatal, but they're not going to tell me what to do. Well, I think I would walk out of that building thinking, well, this is a building full of quacks, right? What good is telling me that I have Fenster's syndrome, but not telling me what to do about it, except maybe go home and die. Go to the mortuary and arrange for the funeral. And this is the same situation we have in many respects with dealing with the Second Amendment and gun control. Well, we're going to oppose these people by lobbying. We're going to oppose these people by going to the courts. Blah 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 blah. Yeah, okay. You go into the courts, and sometimes you win, and sometimes you really lose, as in the Colby case. You go into the legislatures, and sometimes you prevail, and sometimes you really lose, the way they did in Connecticut and Maryland and New York and New Jersey now, and all the time in California. Whereas the solution to the problem is the constitutional solution. If we actually follow the constitutional requirement, then Soros's theory and Blomberg's theory and Chuck Schumer's theory and Dianne Feinstein's theory of gun control disappear. They're gone. right? And I just find it fascinating, having been to so many of these things over the years and listened to so many of these people talking, that this, what I call the school solution, the simple solution, the solution that would be taught in any class in which the instructor has really read the Constitution, is the one thing they don't want to hear. Now, you explain that to me, Dan. I mean, these people all secret agents of George Soros and Michael Bloomberg? Do they all have pictures of Chuck Schumer up on their walls?
I think they're all, as you say, useful idiots, or at least a lion's share of them.
Well, I don't know. It's hard to call them idiots. I mean, in many instances, these are people who are, fairly well trained, at least in law, and they'll give you all these arguments why the Heller decision is so great and the McDonald decision is better, and so forth and so on, and the individual rights theory. And I look at that and I say, yeah, well, of course, you're playing under the other side's rules.
Exactly.
Right? You're accepting their theories of this, and you're playing within their set of rules. And, oh, by the way, look where their set of rules leads. Here you have this Colby case, which absolutely destroys you.
Yeah.
Oh, well, okay. And then that's, there's no comeback from that. I mean, you don't hear them saying, well, yeah, we've taken the wrong road. We have to backtrack a little bit. Robert Frost, 2 roads led into a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. Well, they took the one traveled by. Now they got to back up to this other one, right? But they don't want to do that. I just find that fascinating. I think the same thing is true in the area of the Federal Reserve, which is another disaster-prone area. I've been to so many of these monetary conferences, and they'll argue back and forth about minutia and whether the interest rates are being set too high or too low, or quantitative easing is bad or good. And nobody wants to say, wait, but the real problem is the existence of this thing called the Federal Reserve. There's no constitutional mandate for this. In fact, quite the opposite. This is an anti-constitutional structure. We need to abolish this thing. Nobody wants to talk about it. They all want to argue within the context of the Federal Reserve's continued existence. So as long as you argue within the continued existence of the Federal Reserve, you'll never solve the problem the Federal Reserve is causing. As long as you continue to argue within the context of, well, gun control is something that has political ramifications, the courts can decide so on, you'll never solve that problem. And the other side will win because they are better organized than you are. They have a lot of money. They have pretty much saturated the mass media with their propaganda. And apparently they are able even to get people like Mr. Trump to sit down with Dianne Feinstein and encourage her to put her gun control assault weapons bill into some other bill that Trump is in favor of. I mean, you saw that where he's sitting at Biden on one side and Feinstein on the other. He's sitting between the devil and the devil's grandmother.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what's Snape is going on there? I don't attribute Mr. Trump the moniker of a Manchurian candidate. I don't think he's someone who's been put in there by the opposition, under false pretenses. I think he shoots from the hip quite often. And as a businessman, I can't imagine he spent much time thinking about the Second Amendment. But somebody should have tapped him on the shoulder before he sat between those two, and somebody should have suggested to him, don't say anything good about Dianne Feinstein's assault rifle ban. Who does he have advising him up there?
Mm-hmm.
You see? So this is our problem. Even when apparently we get someone in at the White House level who has made the right statements, at least, during the campaign, how he is going to protect the Second Amendment in some way, when he actually sits down at the table, we find Dianne Feinstein sitting on his left. Okay. What does that tell you?
Mm-hmm.
We're in big trouble. I mean, that's what that tells me. We, our side, the people on our side of the yellow line, are in extraordinarily deep trouble. And until we get back to some first principles, which the other side cannot argue against. So all this gun control goes on the basis of what they call the balancing test in legal parlance. Well, on the one side, there's public safety. On the other side, there's the individual right to have a gun. On the one side, there are school shootings. On the other side, there's personal defense of your own, blah, blah. And we're going to balance these things out in some way in the legislature and in the courts. Well, of course, that whole process is what I would call non-scientific. There's no scale that's there where you can read, on a meter of some kind when you have a balance between these concepts. It's baloney. That's an argument that was invented in the court so they could say whenever they wanted to that a statute was constitutional or wasn't constitutional. And no one could gainsay them because the balancing concept is not subject to scientific verification or falsification. It's all baloney, all right? But when you get back to the actual Constitution, you get back to the concept of a militia. This is what a militia is. We can show this historically. This is in the Constitution. This is what we have to have. This is its relationship to guns. And then all the rest of this stuff disappears. We're not balancing anything. This is history that you can show, as I like to say, apodictically, with complete philosophical certainty. And I put out a book called Sword and Sovereignty. It's on Amazon. I had to put it out on CD-ROM because the thing is so long, in which I went back and looked at the actual history of the militias in the various colonies and then the independent states. What were these things that the Constitution called the militia of the several states? What was this thing that the Second Amendment calls a well-regulated militia? It was there in history. And I go through all of these statutes, and they're all cost the same for that whole period. They don't change very much at all. Certainly in basic principles, they don't change. And you can pull from that history, from all of that legal literature, which is undeniable. It's on the books. You can pull certain principles in terms of who was involved, what they had to do, what arms they had to have, what were the penalties, and on you go. Here it is, boom, 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 boom. And if we had this structure, if we had the shadow of this structure, then, as I said before, this gun control as it's understood today by its proponents, by the Soros types and the Bloomberg types and the Schumer types, this would disappear. It would be gone. Now, the NRA would still be here. They wouldn't be fighting against gun control in the legislatures. They'd be training people in many different ways, in terms of the history, in terms of the principles, in terms of the actual in-the-field training. There'd be a huge amount of work to be done. And private organizations could certainly help to do that. The NRA has had a long history. It's had a long history of positive interaction with the regular armed forces, right? Going back to the turn of the 20th century, for heaven's sake. So they could certainly be in the forefront of doing that kind of work with respect to the much bigger job of training very large numbers of people for the militia. And we're talking about beginning, say, 12, 13 years old. If you're going to start in the militia in 16, you better start learning things about the militia earlier on. So this would start in middle school, whether the National Education Association likes it or not. All right? Every school would have to have this because this is a constitutional duty, for heaven's sakes. Right? So this would make a complete change in the local educational structure, because now you're going to have these 10, 11, 12, 13, 14-year-old children learning about real constitutional history, learning about the real principles of our Constitution of Free State, not what the NEA wants to tell them it is, right?
Right.
So there'd be a change in the structure. Then from 16 years on up in the high schools, secondary schools, there's going to be classroom instruction and in-the-field instruction, because by the time they get to be 18 or so years old, they're going to be training in actual military, paramilitary, the kind of things they probably get in the boot camps. You want the young kids to at least learn that kind of stuff while they're physically able to do it, right? So you're going to have that kind of militia training, and then on this is going to go throughout their active lives, because they're always going to have some of this duty hanging over their heads, and quite rightly so. Well, this would change the educational structure all the way through the colleges. What kind of cultural Marxism could possibly survive in a college that was teaching constitutional militia principles? Right? Explain that one to me. How would that happen? Right? It would disappear, especially given that the professors would probably have to be in the militia training too. unless they were all conscientious objectors. So a lot of things would change, and I won't go into the many other things that the militia would be involved in: honest elections and creating sound money structures within their own localities. So, I mean, it's just unbelievable what the potential is. But you can't, as it were, take advantage of that potential until you have the structures put in place. And you can't have the structures put in place until the so-called leadership in the Second Amendment category wakes up and says, wait a minute, this is what it's all about. This is what we need to do. And the NRA, for instance, how many members do they have? 5.5 million members, maybe 6 million members now, because there's been a flood of people coming into them more recently. Why aren't they educating? They have their American Rifleman magazine. They have their First Freedom magazine. They have all sorts of propaganda, and that's a fair word to use, all right? Public education, if you want the sanitized version. Public education, as they put out on the internet and otherwise, they could do a terrific job, first among their members, then among the general public on this, because they have the platform, they have the visibility, they have the money, they have the members. And yet they let the other side, they let something that this trivial organization, Southern Poverty Law Center, of course it's got a lot of money, but it certainly doesn't have huge membership, doesn't have a huge staff, certainly doesn't have the right answers. They let the Southern Poverty Law Center walk all over them.
Right. We're always playing in their on their field and playing by their rules.
Yeah, basically. When we have the ultimate answer to this in the Constitution, and as I said, the history of this is so clear. We think about the jury system as being one of the bedrocks of free society, and that's true. But if you go back and look at the colonial statutes, you won't find, and the state statutes after the independence, 1776, you won't find a lot in there about the jury system. It was taken for granted, right? And so if you look historically, you'd say, well, what is this jury thing? Couldn't have been very important to those people because they didn't put in very many statutes. Well, they didn't really need to. But you look at the number of statutes that they had for the militia, and I was amazed when I started doing this research. Over and over and over again, they're passing these statutes. So this is a very serious, extraordinarily serious matter to them. And, of course, they put it into the Constitution. They didn't leave it for Congress to determine. They put it into the Constitution, incorporated the militia into the Constitution, which they considered to be a frighteningly important matter, especially when you're given, who was at the Constitutional Convention? George Washington. George Washington was not a tremendous proponent of the militia. He believed in the regular army as being the basis for national defense. So you could have a militia, that kind of thing sitting over there in the sidelines. But he had some bad experiences with the militia. Right? These people came out and for their 90 days or whatever, then they went back home. They weren't subject to the same kind of discipline. In many instances, they did perform very well, but not always. So you would have thought that someone like Washington would have been influential at the Constitutional Convention, and the Constitution would have come out with something along the lines of, well, the militia's optional. We just kind of leave that out. If Congress wants it, that's okay. If it doesn't have to have it. Or the states don't have it. Wrong. They did exactly the opposite. And that's because they understood these structures were not valuable simply because they could perform military functions. The structures were valuable because when people had arms in their hands, other good things happened. Right?
Right.
And that's what we've forgotten. We've forgotten the basic principles of a free society that the Founding Fathers, to a large extent, took for granted. And we're very fortunate that on that particular point, they wrote them clearly in the original Constitution and in the Bill of Rights in the Second Amendment. Twice. It was like a double check. They made it required in the original Constitution, and they said in the Second Amendment, oh, and by the way, we're pointing this out to you again. Right? And that's not true of the First Amendment. That's not true of the Third, Fourth, Fifth segment. The only other one is with jury trials. You'll find jury trials are protected in Article 3 of the Constitution, and they're also protected in the Sixth Amendment, so they were concerned about jury trials. But that's the point I was making. I mean, jury trials, you don't find a lot of literature, legal literature, in the colonial period, guaranteeing juries and talking about how they're going to be set up, because everyone understood how that was supposed to work. The militia, it's line after line after line in those statute books. And that's what people have forgotten. That's people, apparently a lot of them don't want to pay attention to. And the other side, recognizing that weakness on our side of the argument, is doing what has come to the conclusion that the Fourth Circuit's come to. Yeah, if we can vilify weapons as firearms as weapons of war, we're in. We've got it. We've got it. We don't need an amendment. The judiciary can do this by verbal legerdemain, right? By what lawyers do, playing with words. If we can attach this label, then the Second Amendment becomes irrelevant, and everything that the other side, the NRA people are doing, becomes useless.
Right.
End of discussion.
Right.
End of discussion. Right. So that's the danger we have. We've got to get a lot more people aware of that danger, and then stop the educating. I mean, we've been educated enough. They can read a few things. They'll be educated enough. Take that next step. What are we going to do about it? Are we going to get the NRA and some of these high-level, high-visibility groups out there, pro-gun groups, actively working for what the Constitution says we're supposed to have? I would think that's step one. If we don't get them on board, what's going to happen?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I mean, they're there. They have the membership. They have the money. They have the platform. They have the prestige, I would say. If you can't convince them to do it, well then, what are you going to do? Replace them? Create another organization? Take the place of the NRA? Or some of these other relatively prestigious gun rights groups? No, I don't think so. So that's step number one, is to convince those people in their board of directors, executive officers, that they've got to look at this subject seriously. And I would hope that somebody in the White House would begin to look at this subject seriously, because, as I said, I've got an article coming out that shows, if President, here's exactly how you do it. Here's the statute, and here's exactly what you do to train and organize teachers, administrators, parents, for heaven's sake, and revitalize militia structures relating to the schools in particular, that will end the problem of school shooting, or at least minimize it to the extent that we don't see very many of these things over the course of our lifetime. Obviously, you can't stop every one of these madmen that comes up with a gun. But he could do that himself. He has the statutory authority right now. He does not need anything more from Congress. He does not need anything more from the state governments. He could do it himself. But he would have to bite that bullet, the bullet of the M word. And what's interesting is the statute talks about his using the militia. It's right there in the bloody statute, right? So if I were the President of the United States, that's what I would have said when all of this brouhaha came out about Parkland. I said, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'm turning to this statute, Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 253, authorizes me to do this. And I've got some people here in the White House offices that are working on the executive order, and, by next Tuesday we'll have this out, and we're going to go forward. Well, and what would Southern Poverty Law Center have been able to say?
Let's hope that the people in the White House are listening to what you're having to say, Edwin. I hate to say it, but we've run through our 2 hours, and we're at the end of the program. Would you like to just very, very quickly tell our listeners some of the things you're working on before we go to the commercial break?
Well, I'm working on exactly these kinds of projects. In this particular instance, what Mr. Trump can do with the statutes that are available to him in this particular area. There's a lot there.
There's a lot there. Let's hope that we can get them to respond accordingly. Well, thank you for being our guest today.
My pleasure,
and we will have you back on at some point, because I know our listeners are fascinated with the concepts that you're talking about. So.
Anytime, Dan. My pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
They say we need to spread the wealth. They pretend to guard the health of the feeble and the poor, while the hand they hold behind their backs confuses and conceals the fact that the wolf is at the door.